Hello and welcome to the DGCAD AutoCAD 2004 Level 1 Lesson 6. In here we're talking about some common tools that we use to draw accurately with our drawings. So I've kind of grouped them in different groups here where they're related. We have our snap and our grid, which we'll talk about right away, and we have not to be mixed up with object snap and object snap tracking, polar tracking. So these three are fairly related, and we've got some other topics I'm throwing in here, which is the coordinates, display, flip screen, and help. And the reason being is we're talking about our toggle keys here, our function keys. So we've got F9 will turn our snap on and off, F7 will turn our grid on and off, and so on and so forth. F1 is our help, we know that. If we're in the middle of a command and we hit F1, it'll actually start up help and go into that actual command. So let's get started here with what we have is our snap and our grid. The other thing that's related to our snap and our grid is actually our limits, which we learned earlier, because the grid will fill to the limits. Okay, so we're going to zoom back out in our floor plan here, and I'm going to hit my F7 key. F7 is going to turn my grid on, and the first thing it says is grid too dense to display. Because it's so fine, it's going to show some dots. If I zoom in far enough and I do RE for regen, I might see something. I have to be inside my limits to do that, and I think my limits are set over here somewhere. So let's just take a step back. We're going to start by resetting our limits. For instance, I'm going to type in limits, or I could go up to my dialog box under format, and lower left corner I'm going to say I want it to be here, and upper right hand corner I'm going to actually pick a point right up over here. So I've set my limits to be that big. Now what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to go into my grid and snap settings. And to get in there, there's these buttons down here we're going to be talking about. Right-clicking on here, right-clicking on, for instance, well, let's get our grid button up here. I'm going to right-click over here to the right, and I'm going to see that grid is actually turned off. So I'm going to turn that on. Now I'm going to get my grid button in here. I'm going to right-click again. I'm going to turn off my paper model space, which I don't need for the time being. Turning my grid on and off here. Right-clicking on there and going into settings. Okay, inside of here I've got my snap and grid. Now I can turn that snap on and grid on, and I can control that by the spacing of the snap. Okay, now I'm going to go back to here and set my grid to be snap type to be grid snap rather than polar snap for the time being. So inside of here I'm going to set my snap spacing, we're going to see what that does with our grid, to, for instance, 2 feet. Okay, now my cursor is going to jump. Okay, we're talking about snap and grid. Notice my cursor. It's jumping in 2-foot increments. Okay, I'm going to turn my grid back on here. Okay, now my grid's not coming on. I'm going to go into my settings. This is a normal exercise. So what happens is your grid will follow the snap setting if it's set to be 0. Okay, I'm going to go back in. I did that a bit too quick. I'm going to right click, go back into my settings. If your grid spacing, X spacing, Y spacing over here is 0, it'll follow this, so then you can control it with one setting of 2 feet. Okay, and then we can turn them on and off. So first we set our limits. We set our grid to be most likely 0, and then we can set our snap to be 2 feet and hit OK. Now we can see we have those white dots at 2-foot increments, and we jump around. We draw a line now, pick points. It'll only go. Now because my ortho is on, I'm going to hit F8 for ortho. Now I can just do a join the dots. This is a nice easy way to learn how to start drafting. Okay. If you have nice easy increments, you can quickly go around and draw an object like that. Okay, if you don't want it on temporarily, okay, notice the dots. I'm going to do RE for regen right now, and it's going to show more dots, and that's because now I'll do RE again, enter. So as I go in and out, the dots are filling my display, but really just to my limits. Okay, so when you're you get in and you start drawing and you go back out and the dots for your grid aren't on, then you can just do RE for regen, but set your limits first. Now I'm just going to erase these objects here. Notice how my mouse, you don't want to work in this aspect for too long. What you're going to want to do is you're going to want to turn your snap off, which is F9. Okay, and now you can work freely in between with the grid staying on. If you don't want the grid, you hit F7, the grid's gone. So grid and snap, F7, F9. Okay, controlled inside of here, going inside. If we want, I can set this to be 1 foot. Okay, now what happens? F7, F9. Okay, my grid is set at 1 foot, but my snap is set at 2 feet. So I'm snapping to every second dot when you look at the screen. There's little dots where the grid is. Okay, so that's grid and snap, and we use that as we please. Okay, you can then go and use snap base, SNAPBASE. Snap base is set to be 0, 0. We can set that to be anywhere we want, and the grid will shift based on that point. Okay, snap base is also a command that's used when hatching. All hatching is usually at snap base, and if our snap base is always at 0, we can see we can actually use that to our advantage with hatching. So snap and grid, not a big deal. I'm just going to turn those off now, F7 and F9, and then you just draw and move things around in that format. Moving on here, we've got object snaps. Okay, that's F3, and we're going to look down here. F3 I'm hitting, okay, object snaps, and object snap tracking and polar tracking. So we're just going to move in over here now. The other thing is with object snaps, I'm going to go right click on any toolbar, and I'm going to grab my object snaps toolbar right away. Okay, and I'm going to grab that. I'm just going to place it down over here, holding my control button in. Oh, that just disappeared for a second here. Hold on. And those object snaps jumped up to the top of my screen, so I'm just going to pull that off. Holding my control button in, I can take and place that on top of there, which was what I was trying to do at the time. So now we've got object snap toolbar. So we've got some object snaps in here. Endpoint, okay, snap from, endpoint, sorry, temporary tracking point. Okay, we've got snap to midpoint, intersection, apparent intersection, more of a 3D command. Okay, extension, center, quadrant, tangent, perpendicular to, parallel, insertion, node, and nearest. So we're going to go through these up and over here. So just starting off with the endpoint snap. So endpoint lets you start or move from an endpoint. So if I start my line command, for instance on my toolbar, I start my line command, and it says line specify first point, I can go down here, say endpoint, and then I can put my endpoint now as I move around. Okay, I can have running object snaps. I don't have to go back now again and pick endpoint if I want another endpoint. I can do that. Okay, try that again. Line from endpoint of here, this is a polyline this time, to the endpoint of there or here, wherever I want, and I can continue along. Okay, I can try to do endpoint maybe of this circle, but it won't find an endpoint on there. Okay, circles are a bit different. So now, rather than having to grab an object snap every time, we can go down into here, into our object snap settings, similar to our, and inside of here we have our endpoint, midpoint, center, quadrant, intersection. All of these object snaps that we use to draw are in here, and we can use these all at one time, and then we can toggle through them with our tab key